Hello, and welcome to We Need to Talk About, a thing where I talk about things that I think we need to talk about. Today, we need to talk about that fucking election that just happened. So, I want to take a different approach than you will have seen pretty much anywhere else, as far as I can tell, in that I don't want to look at this through a lens of the Democrats did this and the Republicans did that. I rather want to look at it as a systematic issue where the behavior of both the Democrats and the Republicans is actually a product of a long standing historical evolution, an evolution towards a style of election which is almost free of politics, a depoliticized spectacle in many ways. The elements of politics that are there are very constrained, are very prescribed, and this came about through a historical evolution that has everything to do with foreign policy and genocide. Now, the polls will tell you that the electing public, the electorate, cares about very narrow things like the price of eggs and so forth, which I think is rather a result of the fact that the polls only ask about those things. So I live in a different country, of course, but I was polled the other day. They asked me to rate a whole bunch of issues on how important I did or did not find them on 1 to 5. And issues of war and peace were not involved at all. Foreign policy wasn't there. There were no questions about fundamentals of the economic system either, for that matter. These are things that are assumed by pollsters as being taken as read. They probably couldn't even conceive of, Johnny Lunchbox or Joe Sixpack or Dumb Jack or whatever you want to call them, having an opinion on these things. However, if we look at approval ratings for US presidents over the years, they go up and down almost entirely on the issue of foreign policy. It is the key thing that people tend to judge them on, whether they're like dropping lots of bombs on innocent civilians or whether they're defending the country from aggression. So the obvious example is George W. Bush, who went up to a 90% approval rating when people believed he was defending their freedoms, down to a 25% approval rating when people actually realized he was a genocidal war criminal. So when they tell you that ordinary people don't care about this shit, well, just ignore them. They don't know what they're talking about. So obviously, genocide has been a massive issue in this election, and if we look, for example, at the African American male vote, like the knee-jerk reaction by all of the punditry is to say that they're concerned about inflation because they wouldn't even think for a second that they might actually think that the whole genocide thing is quite bad. In the end, there's been a lot of postmortems out there. A lot of them are quite good in the alternative media about what the Democrats have done. The mainstream media is terrible. It's absolutely shocking. But the fact is, it really was a concerted effort on the Democrats' part to lose an election. And they succeeded in that. The reason I can say that is because Donald Trump's, the number of people who voted for Donald Trump was actually slightly down on 2020. So he won less votes than he did then. And this is not There shouldn't be a hard candidate to beat. When he was in office, he never broke 40. His top approval rating was 49%. Nothing he ever did actually made people think, oh, this guy's actually done something good for once, Never. So that's the lowest ever top approval rating in history. And the, the next record winner for that is Joe Biden with 57%. And I mean, honestly, if Kamala Harris had been elected, she'd be there as well. So one of the processes that I will be discussing that has evolved through history is this process of choosing less and less appealing candidates, and the way both sides are putting forward people who are, in a normal election, you would not choose to run them. So, the Democrats did everything they could to lose, but of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that their object was losing. That might be incidental. I think the main thing that we need to understand is that they really, really, really needed to constrain the idea of the politically possible. So, what I mean is that they did not want to respond to very clear demands that they do something about the genocide in Gaza by not even doing something, by signaling that they would do something, because they don't want people to have the idea that they are allowed to express democratic power in that respect. Again, like this really, it might seem confusing, but if you see the history, well, once I've explained the history, it might start to make a little bit more sense. So I'll start with the 1916 US presidential election, where Woodrow Wilson, the incumbent, ran on an anti-war platform. His slogan was, "He kept us out of the war." Now, during that campaign, he was always intending to bring them into the war. So it didn't stop him from using that slogan, though. So he ran as the anti-war candidate when he was the pro-war candidate, or one of two pro-war candidates, possibly. I don't really know the details of his opponent very much, but anyway, so basically he was inaugurated in January, and by April, the US was at war. He instituted the Committee or Commission of Public Information, I can't remember which, also known as the Creel Commission or possibly Committee, that basically rolled out a massive propaganda effort. And one of the key methods used in their propaganda was to kind of blend a very, what seemed to be news to people, use to present certain fictions, to blend the line between fiction and fact. So it was a very successful campaign of propaganda. So now I want to fast forward now to the Korean War. So now Truman was US president at the time when the Korean War began. He had obviously inherited the presidency when Franklin D. Roosevelt died, and then had been elected in 1948. His highest approval rating was actually just still during the war years. I think it was about 87 or something like that. But he went into the Korean War. So the way the war happened, well, firstly, the way the war happened was that, contrary to what you might read in a history book, it is not definite that the North attacked the South. Let's just get that out there to begin with. The North had a counteroffensive plan, which the Soviets had rewritten to make it rather more aggressive. And their story, and this is still the story taught in, say, Chinese history to this day. Like if you went to school in China, this is what you'd be taught as historical: is that the South launched a major offensive against them, and then they initiated this counteroffensive plan. Anyway, for various reasons, they were left to invade the South, which had been deprived by the US of like anti-tank munitions and so forth, which meant that they were drawn into shooting right down to the South, despite knowing that they were stretching their lines and making themselves vulnerable to an amphibious landing. They couldn't really, I wouldn't say resist the temptation, but they were essentially, they went all the way down to almost the bottom of the Korean Peninsula, to Busan, or the Busan perimeter, which meant that they occupied something like 95% of the country at that stage. And then there was a landing at Incheon, which is near Seoul, in the middle of the country, which they had predicted, but they did not have the ability to guard against. And then they were pushed back, and then the whole front went way right up to the very north of the country. And then the Chinese entered, with the fighting now on their border, the Chinese entered, they entered by sending a volunteer army. They ordered their soldiers to volunteer, and they sent in volunteer army, and then there was what's called the Great Bug Out, where without a lot of explanation, the UN forces, the US-led UN forces, retreated right back to almost exactly where the US had divided the country in 1945 on the 38th parallel. And then it stopped, and that was the first 9 months of the war. It would go on for over 2 years with basically a static line, where the US pursued a policy of so-called attrition, which wasn't really attrition. It was basically killing the other people as much as you can, which might sound like attrition on the face of it, but it isn't really, because it's not aiming at reducing their capacity to fight the war. It's basically about killing, while they were carpet bombing the north. And all the while there were peace negotiations, which the US were sabotaging constantly, even to the point of attacking like a rogue aeroplane, supposedly attacking the negotiating party of the other side. And then so the US would undermine the peace negotiations, which, much to the horror of the British delegation, among others, and then they would use their propaganda and their kind of racially informed propaganda abilities to say that it's the feckless and ruthless and callous Asiatic communists who who hate peace, who just illogically and irrationally refuse constant offers to try and make peace. So they were doing this for the bulk of the war, and I'm sure that the generals were probably very happy with the fact that they could, for every 100 or so US lives lost, there were 2,000 communist, Chinese and Korean lives lost, and they're using the South Koreans as the shock troops, and so the generals probably thought they were just about humanitarians because they were only sending whatever, a few dozen US personnel back in body bags every day, or whatever they considered acceptable. But of course, this was since the US public couldn't see any purpose in this war at all. Um, they were not so impressed with the US personnel coming back in body bags, and they probably weren't that impressed as well with the whole thing of war and killing and Koreans dying either. So, and it was brutal. It was a horrible, horrible war. But I would also say it wasn't. It was a genocide as well, because if you are, like, almost by definition, if you're seeking to prosecute a war forever, then the purpose is not actually a true military purpose. You are seeking to inflict damage on the other party as a nation, as a people. If you were trying, you would be like, if you wanted to win militarily, you'd be attacking this. The center of gravity would be, the war fighting capacity of the other person or their political will. Whereas this was almost exactly the opposite. They would claim to be using attrition and be trying to attack the political will of the others, but in fact they were just killing. And the carpet bombing in the north had no, I mean, it was, they only got away with it because attacking civilian populations had become such a norm during World War II that no one, like, it wasn't examined as such, but there was no military logic in bombing a people back to the Stone Age, and they literally did. The population of North Korea lived underground for years, and a lot of them did anyway. So this was genocidal in nature, and the US public didn't like it. So come 1952, there's an election, and Eisenhower stood against Truman, who had become the most unpopular president in history, still is to this day. He has the lowest ever approval ratings at 22%, lower than Bush's 25%. And he left office with slightly more than that, 33, something like that. But he still never really recovered from how horribly unpopular the war made him. Not anything else. I mean, well, there might have been other things, but the war was the driving factor. So this is what I'm saying. Presidential politics is really about war and genocide. So they voted for Eisenhower, and Eisenhower, they'd voted for him to end the war, so he did. I mean, but it's, in those days it was kind of simple. Your party put forward a bunch of policies. They called it a platform, and then you lie about some, you don't lie about others, but kind of people knew where they stood. And if he had not ended the war, there would have been a massive price to pay. So, so this was I guess from an imperial perspective, this is a bit of a loophole you want to close, right? You do not want people to just suddenly have the option of shutting down your genocide just because they don't like it. I mean, how would that work? I mean, so going forward to the next war, which was already starting at this point, in 1964, in a bit of a kind of echo of 1916, Lyndon B. Johnson was running as the anti-war candidate. Now, Johnson had already drafted early in 1964 or even before 1964, I can't remember, some legislation which would give him unlimited powers to take all necessary means to ensure that peace and security were established in Vietnam or Indochina, and his administration would be the one to determine when peace and security was established. So this is an open-ended authorization for war, which, in contradiction to the US Constitution, which says that the Congress has the power to make war. So he had already drafted that. And then in August of 1964, a US destroyer, the USS Maddox, opened fire on some North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Now they opened fire, they spotted them at 9,800 yards and opened fire at 9,000 yards, which is way, way, way outside of the effective range of the torpedoes on these boats. In fact, I've seen the effective range, it might be a mistake. I saw someone say the effective range was 1,000 yards. So this is ridiculous, and they fired, you can look on Wikipedia, it says they fired warning shots. Do you know how many warning shots they fired? I think 240 warning shots. Anyway, so the US attacked Vietnamese torpedo boats who were probably, I think, they're definitely in waters that the North Vietnamese considered their own, but I think, given the distances, I think they're in waters that even the US recognized as North Vietnamese waters. They still attacked them anyway, creating this incident. Right now, here's the tricky thing. Instead of going to the Congress with this incident, what they did was they sent another destroyer to the area, and then on a stormy night, they decided there were lots of radar contacts, and accounts I've read seem to suggest that the radar system had been spoofed to produce these results, and the storm was almost a cover story for this being a mistake, because naval ships are in storms all the time. They don't normally just start firing randomly at water, because that is exactly what happened. They sent out fixed-wing aircraft as well, trying to chase down non-existent things because of these blips that had been produced on someone's radar set, presumably by deliberate interference. And it was this second incident that was taken to Congress and taken as proof of Vietnamese aggression. And this has been an incredibly successful technique, because historians have been it's been just like a lightning rod for their attention, is disproving this thing that people didn't really believe in the first place. A lot of people, Lyndon Johnson, went on record. No, he didn't go on record. He privately said at the time he thought these stupid sailors were shooting at flying fish out there, and then he ordered bombing anyway. That's before the authorization. He ordered bombing in retaliation for something he didn't believe had happened. And then he later said he thought that they were shooting at whales. Maybe I'll return to Lyndon Johnson's character a bit later, because I think he made a practice of saying folksy, often sweary things to get in the history books to make sure that to deceive people, to misdirect people into thinking he was against the things that he was doing himself. So anyway, so McNamara goes to Congress and says that this is all Robert McNamara was Secretary of Defense at the time. This was North Vietnamese aggression, so they vote for this this authorization for war, basically. So now Johnson has an authorization for war, but he's got an election coming up. So how does he campaign? Does he campaign as like, I'm going to go to war against Vietnam? No, of course he doesn't. His opponent is a guy called Barry Goldwater, who is a right-wing hawk, and Johnson runs as the peace candidate. He very famously said, like, I will not send American boys to go 6,000 or 8,000 miles away to do a job that Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. Now, I should point out, of course, that the US was already involved in Vietnam, of course, but not on a major deployment of ground troops sort of way. They're using special forces and an ever-increasing number of what were called advisors, who go around advising people with bullets in their head. I advise you not to be alive anymore. Anyway, yeah. So this was in his back pocket. He knew it all along. He already planned to extend the war, and he campaigned as an anti-war candidate in order to win the presidency, and then extended the war. And when he did so, he would often basically someone would get the military leaders to generate requests for astronomical troop deployments, and he would grant much to say, oh, these warmongers, they're pushing us into war, and he'd grant like 1/4 of that. Now the thing is that the US deployed troops pretty much as fast as they could logistically until they reached a peak in 1968 around. So this whole thing was a piece of theatre. Again, his whole thing of being pushed into what he called that bitch of a war, which he successfully managed to get the historians to record that he was passionate about his Great Society thing, and he was pushed into this horrible war that the poor man didn't want, which is a load of shit, I can tell you. But anyway, so then we come to 1968, and 1968 is a very, 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 very good analogy for 2024 in many respects. And I think we should always remember that the Democrats of today know that too. So Johnson, of course, is a Democrat. His party is being torn apart. They rig the country is getting really anti the war in Vietnam. And again, like Korea, this is actually a genocide. The US had no plan ever for winning, and they were making negotiations impossible and using the racist notions that the not just the North Vietnamese but the South Vietnamese were sabotaging the peace talks when they were they were never ever going to let them happen. Let peace be an outcome. So this was also true going back to 1954 in Vietnam. It was the US that was, they had, in 1945, they arbitrarily divided Korea. In 1954, when the Viet Minh had defeated the US-backed French forces, the US intervened in the in Geneva peace talks, which they weren't even a party to ensure that Vietnam was split in two, just as Korea had been. It suits any empire to have antagonistic parties there. It's part of their divide and rule strategy. And this is true of both the US and the UK with regards to to Palestine as well. The reason they love having Israel there so much is because it's an open wound, a bleeding sore that will never ever see peace and uh, be allowed, because as long as they insist on being a Jewish state, they cannot allow the resolution of the injustices that came out of the establishment of the state. So it's really useful for an empire to divide people this way. So they did that with Vietnam, and in 1968, people are starting to get the very strong impression that this whole thing will go on forever, that it's a massive, horrible slaughter on behalf of um, forces that, whether they thought it was for the benefit of South Vietnamese dictators, or they thought of it as for arms manufacturers, or for mad Cold War generals, or whatever. They didn't like it. The US voting public didn't really much like it, and specifically the Democrats. The people who like the Democrats really didn't like it. It wasn't their values. You see, the thing is that the Democrat Party, by this stage, had pretty much, established itself as the more socially liberal and the more economically left-wing party of the two. At least the base was, and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society had in fact been a part of that. Uh, yeah, even though, of course, you could. If you want to look at what he actually thought of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and so forth, and what he actually thought about civil rights, you might be quite surprised by that as well. But that is a different story. Anyway, so they were faced with this. Johnson pulls out of the election, which sounds familiar, doesn't it? But instead of letting a fresh anti-war face that appeals to all those wannabe voters out there, the machine selects Hubert Humphrey, his vice president, and Hubert Humphrey runs on a campaign of all the things that you hate us doing now, we're going to keep doing them. Meanwhile, Richard Nixon, who people didn't necessarily trust, who wasn't a very appealing candidate, who'd been a bit of a political failure in the past, in fact. That's also a bit of an echo of today, dragging up these people who have failed miserably in the past and going, right, this time, we can polish this turd, especially if the other side runs a turd at the same time. So Richard Nixon campaigned on peace with honor. So he kind of positioned himself as the anti-war candidate. The thing is, of course, he wasn't specific. Same as Donald Trump. Donald Trump has said he will end the endless slaughter and genocide in Gaza. Do we believe him? No, of course we fucking don't. Did people believe Nixon? No. I don't think many people believed him. But the thing is this, they were offered a very stark choice. A person who says, no, I'm not going to stop the slaughter, or a person who says, yes, I am going to stop the slaughter, and you're pretty sure he's lying, but, what choice do you have? So I think, again, a lot of voters, those voters who were specifically engaged with the issue of thousands of people dying every month, would have gone, let's go with the one who says they might stop it. So, it would have been a big factor in Nixon's victory. And of course, what Nixon actually did was not to end the war. Half the people who died in the Second Indochina War died after 1968, when the US public really was pretty much over it, let's say. So Nixon didn't end the war. He extended it geographically, and um, the what happened next was the sort of process, this peace process, which ended up with what's called Vietnamization, which was basically the plan was to get the US forces mostly out of Vietnam and leave the fighting to the Vietnamese. Now, this was part of us. This actually fed into a military strategy, if you can call it that, because it's actually a genocide strategy called an enclave strategy, where they were intending, as they had in Cambodia, they were intending to pull everyone back into cities, leave the countryside to the enemy, which they would bomb to shit, right? Bomb the fuck out of, and have starving refugees in a city where they would just be dropping in like enough to keep these starving people from all dying and loads of weapons so that the war could go on forever. These enclaves would be fortresses. The ability of the Vietnamese forces to take them would be, um, you know, um, non-existent. So what happened? How did this end? Because this is this isn't a military strategy. This is genocide. This is what I wrote. My honours dissertation was about this. It's a genocidal war system. So a war system being like an ongoing system of conflict where, in fact, you don't try to attrit the other person. You're in fact quite supportive of the enemy. That you provide various things that allow the enemy to keep fighting because you're doing it for another purpose. Now, that theoretically could be just to make money selling arms. However, I don't think that's really the essence of the imperial war systems. War systems are used for committing genocide. That's what they're there for. The arms industry doesn't is a symptom, not a cause. So the yeah, I know I'm not very convincing on that topic. You'd have to read lots of my work to actually understand why I say that. Sorry, but I will assert it anyway. Anyway, so this is what Nixon's aiming for, and of course, the Nixon presidency kind of disintegrated, and electoral politics doesn't really enter into what happened there, although he was very unpopular, and all of the propaganda about his unpopularity deliberately focused away from extending the war and committing war crimes and committing genocide onto you know doing mean things to the Democrats, like the Watergate break-in. On the one hand, 500,000 dead Cambodians. On the other hand, breaking into a hotel, which sounds more criminal to you? Well, David Frost made it very clear. With the famous Frost Nixon interviews, like he pressed him and pressed him and pressed him until Nixon finally admitted he lied to the American people, and that was the great crime, according to this propaganda tape. So we have this situation where, again, limited hangout. That's a limited hangout. He's admitting wrongdoing, but it is distracting from the real wrongdoing. Of course, Nixon was famous for, among other things, he recorded himself all the time. Again, to create to create a giant limited hangout, basically. Um, and and ironically, or whatever, in it he discusses doing a modified limited hangout. So a limited hangout is where you admit some wrongdoing to distract from a larger wrongdoing. He wanted to do a modified limited hangout where you make up something that you've done wrong, a fictional wrongdoing, to cover up a real wrongdoing. And I think this is a major technique these days as well. So we need to look out for that one. So that is not as off topic as it might seem, and you'll see this sort of this limited hangout will enter into things more in part 2 of this particular topic. So the where was I? I was talking about Nixon was actually the war was ended at that point not by any sort of executive action. The Congress defunded it. They defunded the war without them having done so. It might have been going on to this day. Now, if you think about it, where the US has gone to war recently, war tends to stay, you know. Now, in Afghanistan, they had to leave after 20 years, though. And in Iraq, they also had to leave after a much shorter time. Now, these are major, major deployments, especially Iraq. But if you think about other places, they're going with less troops. Those wars never end, ever. So Syria, Somalia. If you look at the what's happened since AFRICOM was created, conflict has spread everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but conflict has spread and become endemic. And again, if I would say that as a presumption, if you're looking at mass armed violence and there is no end, and there doesn't seem to be some sort of military purpose that would fit a definition where one side is using their army to try and force a decision on the other side, then you should really be thinking that this is probably genocide. Now, what level of genocide? Of course, we're not talking about rounding people up and putting them in gas chambers. But that is like when Raphael Lincoln invented the term genocide, he had no idea that those gas chambers existed. What he understood is processes such as what is going on in Gaza today, right? That's what he was writing about. He wasn't writing about Birkenau, So, these things are spreading everywhere, and there is no real choice to end them. So the Congress, part of the whole system in the US, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial congressional complex, that was his original phrasing. Actually, they got him to cut the congressional part out when he used it in public, but his original intention was to call it the military-industrial congressional complex. It is a Cold War. It's a Cold War creation that is about controlling the Congress, because in constitutional terms, the lower house of Congress in the US actually has most of the power. It can legislate and it funds everything. It's very hard for anyone to do anything without that. So it is the most powerful arm of the government, but it is also the most numerous and the most easy to divide and control. And the way the military-industrial complex does it, was created to do that, is by spreading the arms industry throughout various places, and allowing the economic benefits to be localized, so that you could always have um, a way of a carrot and a stick there for congressional representatives. And that's been added to, of course, by these massive lobbying things, notably APAC, of course. But this is an annex to the military-industrial complex. It's not. It's not an entirely new thing. It's part of it. It's something that slots into an existing system created to control the members of the House of Congress, to constrain their political activities. And we see the results of that all the time. So the kind of permanent war system becomes a key political reality. And like a lot of these wars now, it's not even in the public consciousness. People don't know how many US forces are deployed to Syria, for example, or and we've seen an uptick in the number of US personnel killed in the Middle East recently, but it's still, way below the radar of most people. And maybe they're finally achieving the dream that the generals of the Korean War were hoping for, that they could keep doing this war that's cheap on US lives, that with complete impunity, without any political ramifications or democratic input whatsoever. So, we've reached this point in time, and you can see how it constrains presidential politics as well. If you look at, like, obviously, George W. Bush was neither a pro nor, well, he was actually, but he campaigned as a bit of an isolationist. So in some respects, he was the anti-war candidate when he came to power. And then he was opposed by Kerry. I think, Kerry was a kind of fake anti-war candidate, but like the 2004 election, the very good indications that while there was a 10 million vote difference between the exit polls and the result, and it does seem a little bit like that election was rigged to return quite an unpopular person to the White House. He wasn't, he was way more unpopular 2 years later, I'll admit, but he was already pretty unpopular by 2004. He wasn't a popular candidate when he first came to office either. He'd kind of, Al Gore was, the continuity candidate. So in some ways he had a lot of baggage, but he still basically won the election, if only just. And then the election was awarded judicially to George W. Bush, which was not, who'd lost the popular vote and really lost the election. So he didn't really win the 2000 election anyway, and he was horribly unpopular before 9/11 because of the scandals of things like Enron and his own personal closeness to some of these shenanigans. So, and then he shot up as defender of freedom and all of that sort of thing. But by 2004, of course, it was looking, a lot of, they just barely got 50% support for invading Iraq in the US public. And that just before they invaded, and it immediately dropped off after that. So it was opposed by the public all the time. And again, that's what real presidential politics lives and dies on, these issues. And he was unpopular going into 2004. Kerry, I don't think he was a real anti-war candidate, but he pretended to be. He had had a very deceptive role in the anti-Vietnam War movement, where he was, for example, he pretended to throw away his medals and he kept them. And then when he was asked about it, he said, "Well, I'm not stupid. I'm not throwing away my medals." He's a product, a Washington blue blood. He tried to get people to lie at the Winter Soldier uh, inquiry, citizens inquiry into war crimes in Vietnam, which would have, it basically was, I mean, it could be seen as a way of sabotaging rather than helping the anti-war effort. It really looks more like this is a politician through and through who saw the anti-war movement as a means of building political capital and generating votes for himself rather than a genuine anti-war voice. And I know he did good work about about exposing the CIA shenanigans later, but again, like that could easily, it's like all of these things they could be real or they could be just ways of building up political capital. Like, for example, Obama voted against the invasion of Iraq, and how much did he dine out on that? How much room did that create for him to be a war criminal? That one vote, one time, I mean, you've got to be very careful about taking any politician at face value because they are manipulators by trade. Their communications and their relationships are instrumentalized, and that's the way they are thinking. And unless you get people coming out of an activist background coming into politics and then maybe learning that as a necessity, the fact is most of them just do it without limits. It's just what they do, who they are. That's, I mean, they're not literally reptiles, but they might as well be, So anyway, so we have this situation again where in terms of warfare, in terms of genocide, in terms of empire, the actual electoral politics, especially at the presidential level, but also, I mean, at the federal congressional level, there is no space for any real questioning of fundamentals of empire and genocide. And, I think that we ought to also recognize that foreign policy in the US is bipartisan. The same, I mean, it is also, I'm talking to you from Aotearoa, it is here as well, but they, in the US, they pretend to have opposing foreign policy ideas, but it doesn't mean shit. Like, Trump has, like, has been accused of being soft on Russia because that's his rhetoric. His rhetoric is soft on Russia. His actual policy when he was in office was the most anti-Russian of any administration in the Putin era. So, the rhetoric changes, but the politics don't between the two. And again, we're the horrible sort of spectacles of people like John Oliver saying you need to vote for Harris because Trump will be worse on the Middle East. How do I know he'll be worse? Because he says so himself. And it's like they cherry pick some things he says, ignore the other things he says, because again, whether you believe him or not, he did actually say, "I'm going to end the slaughter in Gaza." So, I mean, again, I don't believe him, but you can't cherry pick someone's particular things that an untrustworthy person says and says, well, this time he's telling the truth because it proves my point, So, the the fact is that foreign policy is probably not going to change much between the two, and a lot of the fundamentals of economic policy are already predetermined. Now, in part two of this, I am going to discuss the ways in which the system evolved to to constrain politics, and one of them is the three areas I want to focus on are the kind of ratchet system where there's only one direction of travel. So for example, we see that going back to what I was just saying, we have the Democrats running on saying Trump did these terrible things like recognizing the annexation of the Golan Heights and shifting the embassy to Jerusalem. It's like they don't do anything to undo that. They don't do anything to undo. They don't do any serious measures. They haven't done anything serious to undo the problems with abortion access and migration. The things that they say that differentiate them from the Republicans, specifically from Trump, because he's such a good brand to loathe. They don't really do that. So that's one, the ratchet system. The other thing is there's another theory of US presidential politics, which is the WWF. So it's going back a bit when the World Wrestling Federation existed, which is now World Wrestling Entertainment, WWE. The WWF theory of politics, which is that it's all fake, it's all scripted. Now, I'm not going to say it's all scripted, but one thing is definitely true. It is spectacle. And in some respects, whether the outcomes are scripted or not, the procedures are scripted. They're constrained. So it is, the fix is in, it's always in. All right? So there is that. And the other thing is that the way they use electoral politics to propagandize and shape the mass mind of the public, including deceiving them about the meaning of various things through this bipartisan lens that makes them choose one side or another when those two sides are both chosen for to constrain people's options, and also the way it's so visible in this particular election. They are getting people to morally inculpate themselves, to sign on to genocide, to immoral things, to endorsing poverty, to endorsing hatred, to endorsing genocide, to endorsing war, and so forth. This is a way of manipulating the public to create really well, if you want to see how far it can go, all you need to do is look at the Israeli public today. All right? And if you can't see them as a reflection of the US public in extremis, then you need to look again, because this is, they're both, these things are always experiments in mass psychology. And the Israeli experiment might be newer, it might be more extreme, but if you think about the way patriotism and nationalism is used in the US as well, it's not really that much different. And what we find disturbing about Israel is their proximity and their visceral engagement with killing and hatred, whereas the US and Europe and Britain and so forth, they can do it at a distance, but they can be just as violent, and they certainly have killed a lot more people. And when they kill them, they don't kill them with more sanitized, more anesthetized methods. They just do it off camera. I will be talking about those things in the next episode to finish this topic off, and I hope to see you then.